Hey folks, welcome to the E-commerce Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Gaffin, Director of Digital Product Strategy here at CTC. And I'm joined today, once again, by Luke Austin, who's the Director of Growth Strategy here at CTC. Luke, what's going on, man?
We're deep in it. November.
That's right.
Black Friday, Cyber Monday is right around the corner, but it's an exciting time. Simultaneously doing BFCM planning execution, 2024 planning and forecasts. But this is what we're made for.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you sort of coming out of the trenches for a little bit to talk to us here. Because, yeah, it is that weird time where you have to think about the biggest time of the year and then also do all of your prep for next year as well. So if everybody's been listening to or listened to last week's episode, we started part one, or last week rather was part one of a 5-part series where we're talking through CTC's Prophit system, which is essentially the operating system that we put into place to create predictable, profitable growth for our clients. And what we're sort of hoping to do with this series is talk you guys through exactly the types of things that you can put into place to help create a similar profitable or predictable, a system for predictable profitability. Let's put it that way. And of course, we are happy to do that for you as well. And you can get in touch with us about that if you want to. But in the meantime, we're moving on from part one, where we talked with Taylor about setting your main business objective. How do you figure out what you want to do with your business? How do you get clear on that so that it can serve as a directive for the rest of the team and something to execute towards? Now we're moving on to part two, which the title of part two we're calling Model the Possibilities and Choose Your Path. And so this is kind of where your day-to-day sort of lives here, Luke, right? Like sitting down, looking at a client and looking at their business and thinking through how can we build a model, and then how can we execute against that model, and then develop more granular KPIs across a number of different metrics. So Luke, why don't you talk to us a little bit about what, maybe start at the very beginning when a client comes on board and you have to think about developing a growth plan for them. What's the next step after you sort of establish what their business objective is?
So I would say we actually take a different approach from the beginning. So the team of growth strategists that I oversee, we don't start by asking what the client's goal is. Understanding the business objective is crucial, as Taylor walked through. But what we're trying to do is, based on the business data and performance, inform what the business objective should be based on what time window the brand is wanting to realize or maximize their profitability within. All of this conversation around defining the business objective really comes down to, what time period are you wanting to maximize profitability within? Is it next month we want the most cash in the bank and maximize our profit dollars for the end of 2024? Is it in a year from now we're trying to go through an acquisition, and so we want to maximize our 2024 P&L to maximize the profitability in that time frame? So I would say that's the core question that we want to understand and get clear on with clients. But then what we'll do is take that indication of the time window we're trying to maximize profitability in and build our system around that, rather than having our system informed by some sort of revenue goal or efficiency metric or year-over-year growth number, whatever it might be.
Right. So it's about, the first step then is essentially about translating whatever the business objective is into the language of profitability over time, essentially. So
Exactly.
Whatever your objective happens to be, let's say it's a certain revenue goal or whatever, what does that mean in terms of the amount of profitability that you're looking for over whatever window of time? Does that make sense?
Exactly. Yep. And that's as honest and transparent we can be together with our partners early on about that conversation. It's most helpful for everyone, for us to help inform every P&L line item in the context of that business objective, and then for us to be aligned with the client on the decisions we're making on a day-to-day basis that build towards that. And we get really clear about what this looks like with certain clients. Like I mentioned, I'm trying to sell my brand by the end of 2024. So I'm trying to maximize my TTM EBITDA at that point in November, December of next year. That's the goal that we're maximizing against. Other brands, it is, we have, a credit line through a bank that's going to give us really good rates on capital to be able to invest in the business. But we need to show 3 months of consistent efficiency in terms of ACoS and CAC in order to access that. The business objectives can be widely variable, but the clearer we can get on those conversations and the more honest we can have those conversations early on is really what we press for, because we can be the best partners then once we have that context.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's talk about what happens after that sort of profitability window has been established, let's say. And maybe another way of framing that would be to say, to jump to the end, we've talked about, Taylor's talked about a lot on this podcast, that the final step, the thing that we put into place for our clients, is a very specific forecast that holds every dollar accountable every day and tracks 35 key metrics against very specific targets that you can sort of look at every day to see if you're on, or you're on pace or off pace rather. So how do we get from what we've just talked about, that profitability window, to getting to a place where we can start to actually build and execute against the plan?
Yeah, that's great. So for those listening as well, we're going to be sharing some visuals here. So we'll have those up as we walk through some of the pieces of our system and what they look like.
Mhm.
But to your point, Richard, what you just said, what we're getting to essentially, what could be like a very tangible output of the system that we're building is our Statless daily email. So it's an email delivered into your inbox every day, or even more frequently, if you like, that shows performance against a target for all 35 plus of those key metrics. So this is an example of one of those, November 1st through 6th of 2023, where we can see we're 4% ahead of contribution margin, we're 3% behind revenue pacing, we're ahead of spend, behind MER. So total business metrics, we can see the performance by day. And then we can dive into our customer cohort level metrics for returning customers, returning revenue, returning orders, return rate, new revenue, MER, weighted CAC, et cetera. And then we can get down to our paid performance and then our channel performance as well. Google, Facebook, Bing, TikTok, Snapchat, whatever else might be running as well. So this is the output is every day we understand, are we ahead or behind? Are we green or red for each one of these single 35 plus metrics that ladders up to the contribution margin goal that we are indexing against for that month, which is based on the business objective, right? So that's the end output of the system. That then every day, this is an example of how a growth strategist here at CTC interacts with that system and helps to drive the profit system for our clients. Is in the context of the performance. Whenever we're greater than 10% off of the projection on any given day in terms of revenue, contribution margin, ad spend, the growth strategist is identifying that, proactively reaching out to our brands to say, hey, here's where we are off yesterday. Here are the opportunities to get back on track. And here are the actions that we're taking with the media channel strategist, with our email and SMS strategist, the creative strategist team to get back on track. And this is an example of what one of those emails could look like, where we see performance against target for each of those 35 metrics. And we can identify very rapidly that this brand is below their ACOS goal or their MER goal. And that's because their Google efficiency, their Google ROAS is behind target for the month, while the spend on that channel is ahead of target. And so the actions coming out of this email is we're tightening our efficiency constraints within paid search. We're also looking to pick up some efficiency on paid social, knowing that paid search is performing below the baseline, the target that we had set for it. And it's really rapid problem solution identification. So that's the output. Now the question is, how do we build to get to this level of daily expectation?
Right. So
And it
take us
starts
there.
here.
Yeah. All right.
So yeah, it starts here with Statless. So the first thing we do is integrate the data sources for the brands that we work with to begin looking at what the business performance is to inform that long-term objective. So Statless, we integrate Shopify, Magento, Store, BigCommerce, whatever the store is, all of the media channels, Facebook, Google Analytics, Klaviyo, TikTok, Mighty Scout. We have other platforms as well to integrate, Criteo, TikTok, Snapchat, etc. So all of the business store platforms and marketing channels are integrated into Statless so that we can ingest all of the brand's data. And then from that point, we ingest the cost data for the brand as well on a per SKU basis so that we can see every single SKU, what are the COGS associated with each, but not just that, what is every variable cost associated with getting that product to someone's store, right? The cost of delivery associated with that product, taking into consideration shipping, tax, refunds, etc. So we ingest the store and marketing channel data, ingest the cost data, and then we build out a monthly P&L level breakdown for our brands. Specifically, we'll build out a historical closed P&L based on our data sources and compare that one-to-one to the brand's P&Ls that we work with. This is really important because we want to make sure the data that we're ingesting and that we're looking at is aligning with the brand source of truth in terms of what their P&L is saying. So we ingest all this data, but we don't just keep it in a dashboard to show here's your Facebook spend and your revenue from Shopify. We actually build out your historical P&L to make sure that, let's say, June of 2022 and our P&L based on all of our data and our cost data that we pulled in is exactly matching June 2022 for your closed business P&L. Because at that point, we can be really confident that what we model against is going to be accurate when considering the data integrations and the cost data that we're mapping against it as well.
Cool. Sorry.
Great.
Yeah, keep rolling.
Cool. From there, then we build out the monthly P&L. We have it aligned with what the actual P&L for the brand is. And now we can start to forecast for the future, knowing that all of the data that we have is accurate and is going to be aligned with what reality looks like for our clients. So we're going to model out the future. And where we start for that is with the spend AMER model. So the spend AMER model is a linear regression model, takes into account other factors like discount rate, seasonality, and the goal of it is to get to an output where every month we can understand the optimal level of spend to AMER that the brand should optimize for based on their business objective. The business objective, in this case, we can select two different goals for any given month. One is to maximize for first order revenue. So that would be maximizing the amount of new customer revenue volume you can achieve. The other would be maximizing for first order contribution margin. So maximizing for profitability, contribution margin volume off of your first orders within the given month. So each of these two objectives, we can select which one we're optimizing for, and then we can select the month that we're optimizing against. And that's going to change the output of the model so that we can see in April, the optimal spend level for max contribution margin is 160,000. Whereas in June, it goes down a bit to 150,000. And every month has a different slope in terms of the efficiency frontier that we can spend against to maximize against the brand's business objective. So modeling the future starts first with modeling new customer revenue and the spend AMER model. And then the second piece of it is modeling for returning customer revenue, so that we can get to a total business expectation for total revenue. So this is an example of a notebook of one of our retention regression models. It's a linear regression model, accounts for seasonality as well, also accounts for degradation in returning customer behavior over time as brands increase their new customer volume and those cohorts change. So this is an export of what that notebook looks like as our data science team develops a retention regression model that ultimately gets us to an output of a strong level of confidence in this regression model to predict future revenue from returning customers. And we can see here what the output of that looks like, where every month we see what the retention rate for each of our monthly cohorts looks like for returning customers. And that gets us to a returning customer revenue expectation for every given month as well.
Gotcha. So essentially, like, because obviously this is a lot and it's very complex, but we're modeling new customer revenue based on past seasonality, essentially. Is that correct?
Correct.
Sort
Yes.
of, or just on a historical, and then the returning customer revenue. Obviously, it's similar, but the idea there is to model LTV, essentially, right? So you have some sense of
Yep.
the amount of revenue you can expect to return to you over a set of time periods, let's say. So 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it happens to be.
Yep.
And with the combination of those two things, you can make a possibly accurate, or at least a prediction about future revenue that you can then build the rest of your execution towards.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially the custom models for spend AMER and retention they take into account a large number of factors. Like you said, seasonality can mean the degradation of the cohorts, count percentages, which would tie to, the marketing calendar or sales that are running. But for any given model, we'll take into account 2 to 3 or maybe up to 6 of those factors. The goal is to get these models to an output that is a statistically significant high confidence level output of
Mhm.
the regression model. So we'll take into account as many factors needed to get it to a place where we have a high confidence level that these models will predict future revenue. And essentially that gets us to, again, a statistically significant output that has a confidence interval, a confidence level associated with it, that we're mapping returning customer and new customer revenue against, rather than a human or maybe a group of a few humans picking numbers for what may be expected in each of these months. This is a statistical model that's running through a much larger number of variables and scenarios that humans, it would take a long time for a lot of humans to do that by themselves.
Right. The idea is to get us away from using our intuition to model, basically, which is what a lot of people end up doing, and towards doing something like a little bit more maybe algorithmically correct, complex, or something that's capable of doing computations that we aren't. Okay,
Yeah,
so maybe let's do a quick aside on explaining some of the like statistics jargon that goes into this, because I think that's an important thing,
sure.
especially for people who are new to this or people who aren't like statisticians or don't have one on their in their employ like we have Steve's. So talk to us about the linear regression model, or what a linear regression model is, and then we can maybe get into the idea of like what counts as something that you're statistically confident about or whatever. So let's talk.
Yeah.
Tell me about linear regression models. What is that?
Yeah, that now I'm pressing against my frontier in
Yeah,
terms in terms of my
interesting.
level. So yeah, Steve and data science team are really smart folks that have been trained to do this. So I'm not going to be super helpful in walking through all the technicals that go into these models. What I what I what I will say is the output of these models is we're trying to get to an R squared that is a strong R squared that we can have a good confidence level in. And so R squared, anything below zero point 0.5, we're discarding in a model. Like that's not going to be predictive enough. So folks, if yeah, that can be sort of like a rabbit hole for folks to go down to better understand regression models and the strength of the models as indicated by the outputted R squared value. So what we're trying to get to is an R squared value above at least zero point 0.7 for each of these models that gets us to a high level of confidence. But for most of these models, we're in the zero point 0.8 to zero point 0.9 range in terms of the R squared value. So we can see for this regression model for returning customers, it's a 0.833 R squared value. And then that's the confidence level that we have associated with each of these to then understand that regression model can confidently predict the future output of what this looks like. And then these notebooks are good examples of some of what we look at. So like I'll pull out a couple of different things here. So as we work through these models, again, we're taking into account each of those factors, layering them onto the brand's data
Mhm.
to try to find a good fit that's going to get us to that high R squared number. So what we can see here is like this is LTV lift for this brand over the course of different percentage intervals and then across a monthly time frame. And we can see there's like very little fit, just like plotting all the data on a chart. We need to fit it to some sort of structure that's going to allow it to be more predictable. So we can see here is this tells us there's more information to dig into. Taking a straight retention average won't yield good results. This is super important because most brands, if they're doing returning customer forecasting, are using a straight retention average or maybe monthly differences in retention percentage, like retention rate. So basically saying, okay, we can expect, 16.1% of our new customers are going to be retained on average over a yearly time frame or over a 60-day time frame, whatever it is. And we're going to use that straight retention average. But as indicated by this brand and most brands, using a straight retention average is not going to get you to a high level of confidence. It might be right over like the year on average will look like that, but every month is going to look wildly different over the course of that time frame. And so what we'll look is that we'll start to try to understand what the seasonality looks like by mapping month and yearly curves for the brand's data set to start to tease out what is a fit of the regression model that's going to get us to a more predictable level. And so what we can see here is once we start splicing the data and looking at LTV lift per seasonal month for the brand, we can start to see trends in the data and then mapping and then the data science team is mapping that seasonality against the plotted data points to get to a place where we start to get better fit of the line that's going to get us to a place where we can predict, over time what the retention rate is going to look like. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop talking because I've
Sure.
I've said already too much that I am not an expert in. But
Yeah.
essentially, the output is an R squared value, which indicates how strong and predictable the regression model is. And we're doing everything that we can, the data science team is, and layering factors to get to a point where we have an R squared value that is really strong.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that final thing you said is probably like the best maybe descriptor of why this is a useful tool or useful model for us, which is the idea of layered factors, right? And I think like
Yeah.
the mistake that a lot of us make when forecasting, especially for forecasting off of no model or just our intuition or whatever, is that we look at historical data, and Taylor says this all the time. We look at historical data and we think that that is a predictor of something that's going to happen in the future. But the reality is that there's all sorts of different factors that affect what happened in the past that mean that the future may not look anything like that. And so I think the idea here is by taking as many variables or all of the sort of relevant variables and sort of calculating their effect on the sort of main variable that we're tracking, which is, let's say, revenue or whatever. If we
Yep.
can sort of, or AMER is maybe the specific example here, but if we can assess all of those factors and use some sort of computer equation to do that, then we can get a sense of actually maybe why the future won't, specifically why the future won't be the same as the past, or the various factors in
Yes.
the past that aren't going to be involved in the future, or getting
That's
us
yeah.
closer to, like, since we're taking everything to account, we may have a slightly better sense that the past may actually be like the future or whatever. But it just gives more things to
Yes.
test against, I guess.
That's exactly right. And a really clear example of this is we've had brands where they're out of stock of core inventory for a 2 to 3 month period in the
Mhm.
past, and that drastically impacts their returning customer cohort performance as well as their ability to spend and acquire new customers efficiently. And so there is a part of layering on the models onto the data, but the reason that really great data analysts like Steven's team are needed to look at this data because it's all in the context of other qualitative factors that are going on, where then we're taking out those 2 or 3 months they were out of the inventory, saying, okay, that's not indicative of the future because we know they have inventory in those core SKUs. So let's separate that out from the model. So it's just as much taking out data and factors as much as layering factors in to then get to a predictable place.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So let's officially move past statistics and linear regressions and whatnot. So really, the steps we have so far are: one, we have the business objective translated into profitability over time. We take that objective, we put it into the math machine, some math happens, and out the other end we have a certain set of targets that we need to, or that we think we
Yes.
need to hit in order to bring a specific outcome about. So once that sort of we've gone through the modeling machine and come out the other side, what are the next steps there in terms of beginning to build a plan that actually humans can execute against?
Yeah, great. So at this point, what we have is a monthly output for first time customer revenue and returning customer revenue, which is great. We have a really high confidence in those monthly values, but we're not yet down to a daily breakdown. So really, we're looking at this at different time frames, right? Business objective down to monthly values. Now we have to break it down into daily values and expectations for each of those core metrics so that we can actually go operate and execute against making that forecast happen. So we have the output from the spend AMR and retention regression models that get us to first time customer and returning customer revenue expectations. And then what we do is we use our cohort level forecasting model to break those down into customer cohort level metrics. So essentially, we need to break down new customer revenue and returning customer revenue into their atomic units to then have metrics that we can execute against on a daily basis. So I'll walk through quickly what this cohort model looks like. Essentially, the key inputs in the cohort input model are ad spend. That's, of course, broken down by channel: Facebook, Google acquisition, Google brand, and any other marketing channels we're spending on. Paid CAC, organic as a percentage of paid, first time AOV, returning AOV, and returning orders. So we're breaking down returning revenue and first time customer revenue down into order level metrics: numbers of order, number of orders, AOV associated with those orders, and then for first-time customer revenue, breaking that down into paid orders and organic orders, and then breaking those down into efficiency metrics. So we can see how we're sort of deconstructing these monthly values of first-time customer revenue and returning customer revenue down into order level metrics, as well as efficiency metrics that now we can go execute against on a daily basis.
Gotcha. So talk to me about, and maybe you just said this and I missed it, but so on the daily breakdown, is that what we're looking at here? Oh no, that's the
This is still
monthly. I
the
gotcha.
monthly breakdown.
So on
Yeah.
the daily breakdown, how are the metrics weighted? So for instance, like it's
Yep.
sort of common knowledge, particularly for certain, let's say actually for Bamboo Earth, for the cosmetic industry, that Saturday is the big day, for instance, and therefore expectation on Saturday needs to be vastly different than it is on Wednesday, which is the worst day for shopping, or maybe it's Tuesday, I don't remember. But anyway, so how does that play out then?
Yeah. Yeah. So have the total monthly values. We're break them down into the order level values within the core input tab. So now we have order level values on a monthly basis, and we need to break those down into a daily expectation. So there's two main factors that are layered on into what the daily value and flow of the monthly expectation looks like. The first and the biggest is the marketing calendar. So any marketing calendar moment that we have planned for that month is going to have an outsized impact on what the pacing and expectation for each of those metrics looks like. So we take our marketing calendar. This is integrated into our growth map as well. And this shows by day for the month what we're planning in terms of any sales, new product launches, our email and SMS send calendar, as well as those days where there's email sends drive higher returning customer rates than days that don't have those email sends. So we layer on the marketing calendar and email SMS calendar to understand what the flow of the month is going to look like, which is going to be one of the factors that informs what the daily values look like. And then what we're also going to do, which is what you mentioned, is looking at the day of week effect for our core metrics to understand what specifically to this store. So we're looking here at Bamboo Earth. What
Mhm.
are some of the specific impacts that Bamboo Earth sees on a daily basis within a given week where there's fluctuations and increases or decreases in demand? And Facebook spend is a really good indicator of just that. What we can see is I'm pulling up the seasonality base for the store, and we can see a day of week effect for Facebook spend, where Saturday and Sunday are the best days in terms of the amount of spend that we can drive through. And Bamboo Earth's a great example of this because everything's being run on cost controls, right? So the only thing that's increasing the demand those days is not increasing budgets. It's actually more volume coming through cost controlled campaigns because there's more
Mhm.
demand and higher conversion off of that demand during those days. So that happens Saturday and Sunday. Wednesday and Thursday are their worst days. Thursday, Friday, basically at the baseline, and Monday a bit lower. So we take into account marketing calendar and then the day of week effects that we see for each individual store on their Facebook spend, Google spend revenue. And that's how we're going to build daily expectations for each of those monthly metrics. So we've broken down the $275,000 Facebook spend goal for the month of August into daily expectations that are informed by the marketing calendar and the day of week effect modeling.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I mean, I think this is a good example too of like how, or rather, of continuing to layer variables essentially, which is yeah on the daily level we introduce this extra level of this is what the day to day looks like for this brand historically, but then there's also a factor that I think is really important to call out, which just sort of there's maybe a parallel here. So like to create the model, we look at the past and we look at what's happened in the past, including this element too, by the way, like the daily fluctuations. But
Yep.
then go back to the marketing calendar tab here real quick. What we're also including in the model is the actions that we're already planning to take or the actions that we're going to take as well. So we have to include as a variable, which I think is always an interesting thing to consider. And we've talked about this a billion times, but it's like why this is different than predicting the weather or
Yeah.
I don't know, predicting anything really. Predicting things that you have no control over is that you have to include yourself, your efforts as a factor in the actual plan, which is when it comes to the daily breakdown, we have a sense given the past of what's going to happen, but we know we're going to do something specific and perhaps even different this upcoming month. and that's going to affect what the model looks like, and it's going to affect daily expectations as well. And so I think that's an important thing to consider as well, is that like it's not, again, it's not like the weather, it's not something that's completely out of your control. It's something that you are going in and affecting. So instead of approaching the month and saying like this is likely going to happen, we'll just sort of proceed business as usual and maybe it'll probably turn out, it's like you have to include the actual execution plan that you already have in place.
That's exactly it. Because how do we know what actions that we need to take or plan for if we don't know what's first likely to happen, right? So that's
Exactly.
step one, is modeling for what is likely to happen. And step two is, okay, based on the business goal, this is where we want to be. Now, what are the actions we're going to take to bridge that gap? What are the marketing calendar moments we're going to add in? The additional email sends, the additional creative to fuel Facebook scale, and then we can understand what we can do to bridge the gap to get from what is likely to happen at a very high confidence level based on our models
Mhm.
versus what we'd like to happen, and then we can model and execute against that.
Okay. And actually, so talk to me a little bit about, let's dig into that process a little bit, because I think this is
Yeah.
really interesting and very sort of practical. It's just maybe let's if there's an example that comes to mind, I think that would be probably the most useful. But let's say you have a specific business objective, which is, obviously in the terms of profitability over a window of time. And you look at the upcoming month, and given the past data, it appears to be relatively likely, or likely with a high level of confidence, that if we proceed business as usual, we're going to miss dramatically. What's the maybe balance between, oh, actually we have to tweak the overall goal, to actually there's some stuff that we can put in place to make something happen that wouldn't otherwise have happened, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So yeah, and I think the language here is always interesting. Like the tweaking the models or what's likely to happen to get to the business goal. Usually the business goal is what's been defined in some spreadsheet, likely months prior, especially now that we're, towards the end of the year here, October, November. The business targets that were initially set at the end of 2022 for November of 2023 aren't are really just like what the brand was hoping to hit at that point in time, right? It wasn't really a goal based on the performance or what was being modeled for that. So I think the first conversation that we always have is every month looking at what happened and then what is likely to happen for the coming month, and then let's adjust the forecast and expectations for the future months based on that, up or down, based on how our pacing is. So then at that point, once we get to the place where we have clarity on, okay, here's what's likely to happen for this coming month, but we would like to see a different outcome. I think the biggest levers that brands have to pull is the activities related to their marketing calendar. There's not going to be a bigger lever that can be pulled within a 30-day window to affect the coming months outcome outside of the marketing calendar that's really going to get us there. And so those can be bucketed into, and this ties really nicely with the conversation from the podcast a few weeks ago in terms of what 2024 growth is going to look like and entail for brands that want to see it, is really innovating margin through product launches, collaborations, and then marketing moments that they consistently integrate onto their calendars. And so the conversation, when there's a gap between what is likely to happen, what the brand would like to happen or needs to see happen, potentially even based on their constraints or their financial goals, then is really around, okay, what are the marketing moments that we can plan for? What are the offers that we can launch? What inventory do we have in SKUs that we can move through an offer that's going to have an outsized impact on the revenue? And in that consideration, of course, is the impact of returning customer revenue versus new customer revenue, where it's in a small time window, it's always going to be easier to drive revenue through the returning customers, specifically through email and SMS. There's a trade off long term for that. But if it's to hit that monthly goal, then that's a consideration as well for the email and SMS strategy and how much more we can get from that customer cohort.
Right. And yeah, and that's maybe a good, or the importance of the marketing calendar to affecting your outcome, I think is maybe a good reason, or maybe a good example of why the forecast is so important to do well in advance as well. So, like in an ideal world, if we had this level of sort of this richness of data that we could build and I think we do usually build like a 24-month forecast off of it, and think
Correct. Yeah.
about like have some sense of exactly what November is going to look like and how far off the mark it might happen to be. But we know that 11 months in advance. Then you can start thinking about things like, I don't know, product drops or stuff with a much longer tail in terms of your ability to produce it in order to affect that. But you can begin that strategy well in advance.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what we're doing right now is building out 2024 forecast through the custom models for the brands that we work with and any other brands that are interested as well, because that'll give us at this point we started doing this actually in August September of this year, so we've been doing it for a couple months now, but that gets us to the point of saying, okay, based on these models, high level of confidence, this is what we can expect the brand performance and outcome to be if we don't change anything drastically from what we've done this year or the year prior. Then it opens up the conversation of, is this outcome something that we're all happy with? And if it isn't, let's talk about those high impact activities that are going to bridge the gap, which to your point is exactly going to be things like a new product launch. Do we need to think about what other collections we add to the store? Do we need to think about partnerships, collaborations, influencers, additional organic traffic? Do we need to think about introducing another marketing peak? Potentially, the brand only had 2 or 3 marketing peaks in that year, and so we can introduce another one during one of their slumps to drive more revenue. So then we can set up 2024 in the context of this is what's likely to happen. Here are the high impact activities that are going to get us to a different outcome.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've hit the point. The daily expectation is built. The marketing calendar, let's say, is built. What's next? Or maybe where do we sort of leave this step of the process, this second step of modeling the possibilities and choosing your path? Where's sort of like what's the final piece of the puzzle before you're ready to go out and build that execution plan?
So yeah, so we've run things through the marketing calendar, we've run through the day of the week modeling, and so at this point we have the daily expectations for each metric for the month that we're executing against. And really, what it looks like is where we started the conversation, where the email shows up in your inbox showing how we're pacing against each of those metrics, and then we have to go make that forecast happen. That forecast isn't going to happen by itself. It defines what the expectation is and the parameters, but now we have to go understand where we're ahead or behind and execute against that. And so I think an example of what that could look like, we have up here the revenue dashboard. The daily email from Statless is in the exact same format, where we have starting at contribution margin, business level metrics, customer level metrics, and then channel metrics is sort of the breakdown here. And so we can follow the red or green in the dashboard or in the email to quickly identify where we're ahead or behind. And then the team makes adjustments from that. So pulled this up for Bamboo Earth, looking at October. So we can go through and see like what an example of this may look like, where this shows up in our inbox, and then we're looking that day at what we can do to get back on track. And contribution margin 12% behind for this time period, revenue basically right at target, ad spend 4% ahead of target. So we look to be pacing pretty well in the context of our revenue goals, but contribution margin is down quite a bit. And so the question is, what are we going to do to move the needle with our contribution margin? And the things that jump out the most to this is the returning revenue versus new revenue expectation for this month are wildly off, skewed by this day on October 1st, which was a sale day. So already we're seeing the reason our contribution margin is behind while our revenue is ahead is due to the higher returning revenue driven from this sale day, which was a higher discount day, most likely, that then led to the contribution margin being lower than our target. So what we really need to do is drive more new customer revenue, and specifically drive that through improving our AMER, because our spend is already slightly ahead of goal, and our efficiency is behind. So increasing new customer revenue through increasing AMER efficiency it has got to be the key focus for what we go ahead and do. And then the question becomes, where are the biggest opportunities to do that? Well, really quickly here, we're seeing Google spend is behind goal, so we can get more volume there because the efficiency is ahead. And then our Facebook ROAS is behind goal, even though spend is ahead. So getting our Google spend increased at the same efficiency level, and then looking for ways to increase Facebook efficiency is what's going to affect that AMER goal. And that's kind of what it looks like on a daily basis once we have these targets and a growth strategist is operating within the profit system. Is now we're able to identify where we're ahead, where we're behind, and then the growth strategist is working with the team to make those specific changes with the paid search strategist on looking at how can we get more volume from our top performing campaigns. That's going to bridge the new customer revenue gap. And then working with the paid social strategist, looking at the top performing campaigns on Facebook. Do we need to get more creative to feel more efficiency there because we're behind our ROAS target? And that's where the execution to make the forecast a reality then comes into play.
Right. And speaking of that execution, so part 5 of this series will be delving a little bit more into like what does a day in the life look like. And at that point, we'll probably go a little bit more in depth into the actual sort of like problem solving sequence here, because like that's my favorite part of this whole thing is delving into the metrics, seeing where you're off on the big ones, and then going down into the more granular metrics and finding out exactly what's happening. It's essentially detective work. And at the end of the day, you've found your culprit, and you have to figure out a way to address that. I don't know, bring the culprit in, if we want to use the metaphor. So we'll dive into that a lot deeper in part 5. It'll be exciting. I'm looking forward to it. But I think at this point, this is where I was sort of like to summarize what we've talked about. And one thing I'll say is like more so than most things we talk about, if you would like us to do this for you, to implement the profit system on your behalf, that is something that we're currently offering right now. So please get in touch with us, comthreco.com, click the Hire Us button, and let us know that you're interested in implementing the profit system for you. We'll go in, we'll build this for you, and then leave you a plan that you can execute against. Or, of course, if you want to bring us on and become a client, then we can also execute against this for you as well. But the point being, we've spent a lot of time building this linear regression model, like getting all of the sort of data magic into place so that this works for you. So, but in lieu of that, I was like trying to figure out a summary, like what's the sort of moral of the story here? Why did we build this? And so I'm going to take a crack at it, and maybe you can too, Luke. So I'll say the idea here is predict the future, go into future months, thinking about what is likely to happen with whatever tools you have to figure out the answer to that question, right? Whether it's just historical data, that's obviously it's not going to be sufficient or not totally sufficient or not as robust as it could be. But let's say last year this happened, these factors were in place, and be sure to examine what those are. Were you running sales? What seasonal things happened? Was it COVID? Whatever. Think about that. Given that information, what's likely to happen the next month? And then think about that relative to your goal, whatever you want to happen, and then figure out how to make up that gap. And again, that sounds a little bit obvious, but I think of what often happens is that you actually just have the goal and you don't have a sense of what's likely to happen. You have no sense of what the reality may be if nothing different happens. All you have is the sort of outcome that you desire to create, and then a bunch of tools that you sort of are using willy-nilly to attempt to create that reality. So that's maybe how I'll frame it. Know what you think is going to happen, and then what you'd like to happen, and figure out how to close the gap. What do you think?
I like it. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, as D2C brand owners, operators, marketers, we all crave predictable, profitable growth. That's the stance that we're taking. And some may say, oh no, I really like that big swing moment, and the site blows up with traffic for 2 days because of we got featured on a Joe Rogan podcast or whatever it might be. And those moments are awesome, but they don't last. And what we actually crave is predictable, profitable growth, so that we can understand every single metric, how we're pacing against it, because each decision you're making today for your brand has an impact on the business tomorrow and months in the future, where we need to understand our performance against each of these individual metrics so that we can continue predictable, profitable growth. That's the system that we've optimized and built for. And I think it's the best that exists. Maybe biased, but
Agreed. Also biased. But I will say too, I do want to make a final point on what you pointed out about, let's say your product was featured on the Joe Rogan podcast. One thing that an error I feel like a lot of people make is the idea that like, oh, we got this huge lift, this outsized bump from this thing happening, being featured on Joe Rogan, let's say. Let's try to repeat that somehow. Other brands that come in like, how can we do the get on the Joe Rogan podcast thing and try to manufacture that? when in reality, you need to think about like, what are the smaller levels you can pull to predictably cause that kind of thing to happen? Because the reality is you can only be featured on the Joe Rogan podcast for the first time, one time. And being able to replicate that is not necessarily the thing you need to build towards. So
Exactly. And likely to replicate that, what it'll take is, okay, here was our revenue last month because of Joe Rogan. This month, to get to that revenue, the only way we can do that is let's run a flash sale.
Mm,
And then you're 12 months down the road and you're running 2 flash sales a month and no returning customers, sponge is squeezed. And now we have to build back up from the ground up and take off all this false revenue. That's what we're thinking about is 2 years from now, what is the predictable profitable growth trajectory of the brands look like that we're working with?
absolutely. So a little tangential, but I'll again leave you guys with, if you would like us to build this for you, that is a service that we're offering. Check us out again. It's commonthreadco.com. Click on the hire us button. Let us know that you're interested, and we'd love to have a conversation with you guys. But until next time, Luke, thanks for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you again within the next 3 weeks. I'm not sure which one if you're lined up to be on any of these, but as always, your insights are really valuable. We appreciate you coming on, and everybody, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week for part 3.